So I'm working on this Chrome extension called Engage a Lot, which will make it faster and easier for YouTubers to answer their YouTube comments by using only keyboard shortcuts. And the last 2 weeks I've spent trying to implement Google Authentication into the app. The benefit of using an authentication provider like Google or for example Facebook or Twitter is that the user doesn't have to create another password in order to use your app. Instead, they just click the Google login button and then they are authenticated because usually they are already logged into their Google account anyway. So this really streamlines everything. And for my extension, it makes sense to use Google as the auth provider because it's meant for YouTubers and every YouTuber also necessarily has a Google account. Maybe I will add other auth providers in the future, but for now Google is absolutely sufficient. The alternative would have been creating my own login flow with my own passwords that I have to encrypt, of course, and then store on the server. But again, this really raises the barrier for people to actually sign up because it's friction in the sign up process. But implementing this authentication with Google really turned out more difficult than I expected. I thought I would just install a library, plug it into my code, and then everything would work automatically. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Now it's not the login functionality itself that's difficult. What is difficult is that the tokens you get back from these auth providers like Google, they expire after like 1 hour. And then you have to take care of refreshing the user session. Otherwise, the user will be logged out and they have to authenticate again. But this is not what I want. I want my users to use the extension and the corresponding website. And when they revisit it a day later or a week later, I want them to still be logged in, at least in the extension. Otherwise, it would be very inconvenient. And this is what makes the authentication flow more difficult. So in this video, I want to talk about the problems I ran into while trying to implement Google Authentication. I want to show you my solution that I ended up with and that works like a charm, at least for now. And I just want to show you the whole process. What piece of information goes from which server to where and how this all works. So this is what I want to talk about in this video. This video is sponsored by Brilliant. Many of you know that I never studied computer science and that I am a big believer in learning by doing and having fun in the process. With Brilliant, I found a great way to catch up on computer science fundamentals in a fun and engaging way. Instead of long and boring lectures, every course on Brilliant is split up into small interactive lessons with images, animations and exercises that help you understand complex topics in a playful way. Many of you are interested in data structures and algorithms, and Brilliant covers these topics in great detail. How does binary search and quicksort work? What's the purpose of parallelism and threading? What are stacks and queues, trees and graphs? Instead of just trying to memorize these concepts, Brilliant helps you actually understand them at a deep level. They cover virtually every computer science topic, including more advanced ones like quantum computing, artificial intelligence and blockchain. And if you're not interested in computer science, Brilliant also has courses on math and other science topics that are super interesting. Try out Brilliant for free by clicking the link in the description or visit brilliant.org/codingandflow. And as a special offer, the first 200 people signing up through my link get a 20% discount on an annual membership. So in order to use Google OAuth in your app, the first thing you have to do is go to the Google Developer Console, create a new client there, and this gives you a client ID and a client secret that you will later have to use Google Authentication or authorization. But we will get to the difference between authentication and authorization later. And this whole process is described in a little tutorial in the Chrome developer documentation, which you can find under this URL. Here they explain how to set up this client ID project in the developer console, how to connect it to your extension, and set up everything with the permissions and all you need. And then they show the authentication process. But the problem is they're using a method called getAuthToken. This is the most simple way of using Google Authentication in the Chrome extension, but it has a big downside. And that is, it automatically uses the user that's logged into your Chrome browser. So the user that's using your extension doesn't have the option to switch to a different Google account unless they also log out of their browser and log into that other account. But this is not what I want. I want my extension to work independently from the Chrome browser. So this is why we can't use this getAuthToken method, which is a shame because this makes the whole process very easy. It takes care of refreshing the token at the correct time and so on. You just have to call it and you are authenticated. Instead of getAuthToken, there's also this other method we can use, which is called launchWebAuthFlow. This is originally meant to use with authentication providers that are not Google, so with Facebook or Twitter or whatever you want to use it for, but it also makes sense to use this with Google Auth if you want to give the user the option to switch between different Google accounts and not to be bound to the account that's currently signed into Chrome. So this is more difficult to set up because you have to pass the URL to Google yourself and you have to configure it properly, but you find a lot of results on Stack Overflow, so it's not that difficult. And depending on the exact arguments you pass to the URL, you get back different kinds of data. One piece of data we get back is a so-called ID token from Google. The ID token is a JSON web token, and a JSON web token is basically used to authenticate a user because we can verify this token on our server, but at the same time the token also contains some data already in it. So for example, the ID, the Google ID of the user is contained inside this token and we can extract it directly out of it. Also the email address, the name of the user and some other small pieces of information. So after we call this launchWebAuthFlow method in our extension and then get back the ID token, what we can do is we can send this token to our own server. On the server we can use the Google Auth library by Google itself to verify this token, and this way make sure that the token is real and it's actually the real user that sent it because the token is coming from the Google authentication process. And then we know that the user is authenticated and we can give them access to the resources they are requesting, to their user data and all that stuff. And when the user logs in, we check if there's already an entry for this user in the database. If there is none, we create it. And if there's already an entry, then we just return the data that's already there. And the really cool thing is, since, as I already explained before, the basic user data like the email address and the name and also the URL to the profile image, by the way, is already embedded inside this ID token, we often don't even have to implement our own registration process because we already have all the data on this user we need. We have an image, we have a name, we have an email address. What more do you need in most cases? So the user signs in via Google, we create the account in the background, and that's basically it. The user doesn't have to go through a lot of hassle to use our extension. Of course, if you need additional user information like the full address, for example, you can implement your own registration process after the user signed in via Google. But of course, you only want to do this the very first time the user signs in. So implementing this initial step is not difficult, and I thought I would be done with this, but the code that verifies the ID token also checks for the expiration date of the ID token, because after 1 hour these ID tokens expire. And if you don't implement some way to handle this, what happens is that the user gets logged out again and they have to log in after 1 hour. Of course, that's very inconvenient. And after researching this for a while, you will figure out that there is also something called a refresh token that we can get from Google. This can be used, as the name implies, to refresh the ID token and get a new one. This refresh token never expires, but in order to get it from Google, we have to pass a whole different set of arguments to the authentication process, which in this case we do through the launchWebAuthFlow method. So we have to pass different arguments to the URL that we are calling, to the Google URL. So with these different arguments, we get back not an ID token anymore from Google. Instead, we get a so-called authorization code. And this is where all of this starts to become very confusing, because there are so many different tokens and codes. There are ID token, refresh token, access token, authorization code. So we send this other request to Google. We get back an authorization code. So we get back this authorization code first. Then we have to make another request to Google and send this authorization code. And then we get back the ID token again, an access token, and the refresh token. And then we have to use the refresh token in the future to get new ID tokens and new access tokens from Google by sending the refresh token again to a specific URL endpoint. So this is all a bit messy. But I can already tell you that it will get easier later because we actually don't need this process for our use case. So keep watching the video because it will be really interesting. So I implemented this refresh token logic into my extension first, and it seemed to work, but it caused several problems. First of all, the code for it is very verbose and a bit complicated. But of course that's not a big issue. If it's necessary, then it's necessary, right? The bigger problems were that in order to get this refresh token, we have to put the client secret into our extension because we need it for the whole process. When we make this request to Google, we have to send the client secret. Whereas before, with the ID token approach, we only needed the client idea. As far as I know, the client idea is okay to share. It's not a secret, but the client secret, as the name implies, has to be kept secret. And in the Chrome extension, there's no real way to hide this if you put it directly into the code, because the Chrome extension is installed on the computer of the user in its Chrome browser. And as far as I know, they can see everything that's inside this extension if they want to. So there's no real way to hide this client secret there. But there is another big problem, and that is we only get the refresh token the very first time the user signs in. And after that, we just don't get it anymore from Google. So we have to store it somewhere, and we have to store it somewhere where we don't lose it. So my first attempt was to store the refresh token into local storage of the browser. We can put it in there, we can later get it out of there. But the problem is the local storage can be cleared, and then the refresh token is gone and we don't get a new one. The other problem is that it also doesn't seem to be very secure to put it there. And another problem is what happens if we let multiple users sign in with different Google accounts. Then it's really hard to manage these refresh tokens. Of course, we could add like the email address or the Google user ID to the refresh token so we can distinguish between them and store all of them in local storage separately. But again, this will cause problems when we lose one of these refresh tokens eventually. So this is where I was stuck for days and try to figure this out. And one way around this would be to store the refresh token on our own server, because then we have full control over it. We don't have to delete it if we don't want to. But then we get to the original problem again. Then what do we use to authenticate the user of our extension to our own server? Because we can't give this refresh token to anyone who asks for it, because then again they are not authenticated, right? So this brought me back to the original problem. But at the same time, another issue came up that I tried to figure out, and that is I was building a website for Engage.a as well, where the user can also log in to see their account data, the plan they are subscribed to, and so on. And I want to do it in a way that the user doesn't have to log in the website and the extension separately. I want this to be completely synchronized, so that when the user signs in through the website, they are automatically signed in through the extension. And when they, for example, click logout on the extension, they should also be logged out from the website. So this should be completely synchronized between each other. And of course, again, for the Google login flow, there are different libraries that you can use. I ended up using a library called React Google Login that I just installed in React, and then you plug it in and then you have a Google login button. You can do some configuration. This is basically the equivalent to the launchWebAuthFlow method in the extension I was talking about earlier. This is the same thing. It brings you to the Google login flow. You give it some parameters, and depending on what you need, you either get back the ID token or the authorization code to get the refresh token and so on. But it also has the same problems. The ID token is only valid for 1 hour if you don't refresh it. So we are back to the original problem. But what I eventually realized is that I actually don't need the refresh token because I don't want to access Google APIs. The ID token itself already contains all the data that I need. After that, I basically don't need it anymore. So you actually only need a refresh token in cases where you need to make access to Google APIs on behalf of the user, like accessing their Google Drive account, for example. And then I guess it makes sense to store this refresh token on your own server, so it doesn't get lost. But in this case, you also don't use the ID token for the authorization. You use something called access token, which you get sent back together with the refresh token and the ID token from Google when you send the authorization code there. Now this is all a bit confusing, but in our case, as said, we don't need to access Google APIs, so we don't need any of these tokens. All we need to do is we need to get the ID token once when we log in. We have to verify it on our server, and then, and this is the thing I wasn't able to figure out at first, we have to establish a session between our server and the client, so the extension and the website. And this process is described in the Google Auth documentation under OpenID Connect. So Google OAuth can do two different things. It can handle authentication and authorization. Authorization is what we need to access Google APIs. For this we need a refresh token and the access code. But in our case we actually only need authentication, which basically means just looking at the ID token, verifying it so that it's actually the user, and then considering this user authenticated to use our server. And this whole process is described here in the documentation under OpenID Connect. They explain how to set this up. Now this all looks complicated, but it's easier by using the libraries that they provide. They take care of all this authentication stuff, so you don't have to write this code here by hand actually. It's not as difficult as it looks. And then eventually we get to this point, authenticate the user. And this is what I read a couple times, and at first it didn't make sense to me. I didn't know what to make of this. Because here they are saying, after obtaining user information from the ID token, you should query your app's user database. This is what I described before. If the user already exists in your database, you should start an application session for that user if all login requirements are met. And this is what I didn't understand. What did they mean by application session? So I kept researching this, and what I eventually figured out is that what they mean by application session is that you set something like a cookie on the browser of your client, of your user, after they logged in. And this keeps the user authenticated towards your own server. Now there are also other ways to handle this. You can also store the session data on the server itself with libraries like Passport.js. Both these different options have benefits and downsides as far as I understand it. I think storing the session data on the server has the benefit that you can store more data because there's more room on your server in the database. The downside, as far as I understand it, is that it's not as scalable or more difficult to scale, because for every user that's using your app concurrently, there has to be some session data on your server. The other option is to set a cookie in the browser of the user. The benefit of this is that your server doesn't have to store any data. It just looks at the cookie and verifies it. The downside is that a cookie can store much less data, so it's meant for more lightweight situations. But our situation is lightweight because we basically only want to store the user ID inside this cookie. And then we can look at this cookie on our browser, check the user ID, and since we know that they were only able to set this cookie after they logged in, we know that the user with this ID is now authenticated towards our server. And what I ended up using is this node library called cookie session, which does exactly as the name implies. It creates a cookie that can keep the user authenticated. And the way this works is that we put this in our server code. We do some setup here, which contains a secret, which is basically just a random string that we create ourselves to make sure that no other user can fake this cookie. It has to be signed with the secret. We give it an expiration date, which at the moment I set to 1 month. Might be too long, but that is what I use now. I have to experiment with that. But I've set it up in a way that if the user keeps logging in, it keeps modifying this token, which also resets the expiration time. So the user will only be logged out automatically if they haven't used the extension or the web app for 1 whole month. If they use it, the expiration date resets all the time. This is what this code down here takes care of. So this is how the whole authentication flow for my app works now. The user can sign in through the /login page on my website, which contains this Google login button. And if they click log in on the extension, they get to the same page. So it all happens through the same page on my website. After they sign in through this button, the React Google login library, which is what puts this button on the website, calls the onSuccess callback. which extracts the ID token, which we need for authentication. It gets this from the Google sign-in. Then it sends this ID token to our server, to this /login endpoint via an authorization header. So we send a request to our node server, which contains this token in the header. This /login endpoint is not the /login of our website. As you can see, this is localhost 3000 at the moment, and this is localhost 8080. This is our server. So this goes here to this login endpoint. And the login endpoint contains this verify Google ID token middleware. And the code for this is in here. This is the part that takes the ID token that we send here out of the header. It uses the Google Auth library up here to call this verify ID token method. This is what checks the ID token, checks if it's valid, if it's not expired, and it is also what gets the data, the username, the email address, the profile image, and so on out of this ID token, which is this payload here. Now this is just a middleware, which means that the login part itself happens afterwards. And in order to keep this payload that contains the Google data, the username and so on, we store this payload in this locals variable, which is automatically passed to whatever comes after this middleware. And as you can see here, after that we call our login endpoint. Here we extract the Google ID out of this payload. Remember, it's contained in the ID token. This is why we can get it. Then we check if there's already a user with this ID, with this Google ID in our database. If not, then we create a new user. This is what is happening here. But in both cases, we now set the session cookie, which is happening down here through the cookie session node library. Remember, at this point, we are already past the verify ID token process, which means that the Google ID that's contained in this payload, we know that this user is logged in. This user already went through the whole authentication process, so the Google ID that we find here, we can consider this user authenticated because we checked the ID token and the ID token was valid and the Google ID was in there. Yeah, then as I already said, we set a session cookie, which contains the ID of the user. This is the MongoDB ID of the user in the database. We could also use the Google ID here because they are both unique. It doesn't really matter. We just need a way to identify this user in our cookie in the future. And the cookie session library will now place this cookie with this name on the client, so on the browser of the user that signed in. And then in future requests, we don't check the ID token anymore. Remember, we just throw it away basically because it will expire anyway. Instead, we just check the ID that's contained in the cookie. And if we can find the ID of the user there, we consider this user authenticated. So this is logged in middleware is what we use in the future whenever the user tries to access one of our endpoints, for example, to get their user data or to change anything in their profile. And now there are several cool things about this. One thing is that this cookie will now automatically be sent whenever we make a request from our website to the server. If we add this line here, credentials include to the fetch request. So if we add this to our website, whenever we make a fetch request, the cookie will automatically be sent and we don't have to add a header to our other requests that we make in the future. For example, when we try to get the user account data. But what is even cooler is that we can now add some permissions to our extension and then it will automatically use the same cookies of our website when we make a request from the extension to the server. So the extension will act as if it was the website, which means that the extension doesn't need its own authentication flow and it doesn't even need its own cookie logic inside it. It basically just acts as if it was the website whenever we make a fetch request from there. It uses the same cookies. This also means that now the extension and the website are completely synchronized. When the cookie is there on the website and the extension are authenticated. If the cookie is missing, both the extension and the website are considered logged out. So this is how the whole login flow looks in action. We can go to the website, which in the future will be getAuthToken, go to the login page, and at this point the extension is still logged out I can log in through one of my Google accounts. We get to the account page where we can see the user's data. And now the extension is also logged in because it uses the same cookies as the website. As you can see, we see my name and the plan and everything here, the same that we can see on the website. We can also log out here or through the extension, but in both cases we are logged out in both places. And the way logout works is that we simply call the logout endpoint on our server, which does this. It sets the session cookie to null, and that's basically it. Then the cookie is gone and the user is logged out. So this is how I implemented authentication in my app, and I'm not 100% sure yet if this is the best way to go, but to me it makes sense and it works pretty nicely. And if I end up needing access to any of these Google APIs in the future, then of course I have to go back to the access and refresh tokens and use them properly, but right now I don't need them. I only need the ID token to log in, and then the cookie is what keeps up the session between the server and the client. But of course, if you know a better way to handle this, then I'm very happy to see your comments under the video. I read all of the comments, and now that I have engaged a lot, I answer to more of these comments again, which is really nice. Yeah, leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments, and then I wish you a nice rest of the day. Take care.